Around 11,000 years ago, on a small Mediterranean island, there was an elephant the size of a large dog, not a baby, a fully grown adult, standing roughly 1 meter tall, the end result of a lineage that had arrived on that island as genuine giants, 4 meters high and weighing as much as 13 tons. Something had taken one of the largest land animals on Earth and over generations quietly dismantled it. If that were a single strange case, it would be curious, but it is not a single case. On a remote island in the South Atlantic, ordinary house mice have grown so large they hunt and kill albatross chicks, birds many times their own size, while the parents sit helpless, with no instinct to defend against something that should not exist. On an island in the Pacific, a bird-like ancestor lost its wings, lost its fear, and grew into something so unlike its origins that when humans finally found it, they had no idea what it once was. It became the dodo, and on an island in Indonesia, something even harder to accept was found in the rock, a member of our own genus, a close relative of modern humans that had shrunk, adapted to isolation, and lived entirely separate from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years. None of this is random. It follows a pattern, the same pattern observed across hundreds of islands in animals as different from each other as elephants and mice, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The question is what islands are actually doing to the animals that end up on them, and why isolation alone is enough to push evolution somewhere it almost never goes anywhere else on Earth. Today, we find out. But before we do, if videos like this help you learn while you relax, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our future videos. And if you're willing to share, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what is the time there? I love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. Now let's get into it. Long before any shoreline is reached, before any animal finds itself cut off from the wider world, there is a quieter process already unfolding beneath every movement, every birth, every small act of survival. It does not announce itself. It leaves no single moment that can be pointed to as its beginning. It accumulates, slowly and without intention, in the background of life. Evolution is not something that aims or decides. It does not move toward improvement, and it does not recognize success in any human sense. It is simply what happens when countless small differences are sifted by the conditions in which life exists. Every generation carries slight variations, subtle changes in size, shape, behavior, or internal chemistry. Most of these differences pass unnoticed, but some alter the balance between survival and disappearance. Natural selection emerges from this quiet sorting. Individuals whose traits happen to fit their surroundings endure a little longer, find food a little more easily, or leave behind more offspring. Those traits, carried forward through reproduction, begin to appear more often. Over many generations, the population shifts, not through intention, but through repetition. What once was rare becomes common, and what was once common may fade away. The environment determines which of these variations matter. It sets the terms without negotiation. A landscape with abundant predators rewards caution, speed, and defensive structures. A place where food is scarce favors efficiency, bodies that require less energy, or behaviors that stretch limited resources further. Climate shapes insulation, water retention, and timing. Competition narrows possibilities, forcing species into ever more precise roles. These pressures act continuously, shaping life across spans of time that are difficult to fully grasp. Body size, metabolism, instincts, and anatomy are all sculpted by this steady influence. Nothing appears suddenly. Instead, change accumulates layer by layer. Each generation, a slight adjustment built upon the last. On the mainland, these pressures form a stable pattern. Predators remain present, competitors occupy every available niche, and resources are contested across vast, interconnected ecosystems. Over millions of years, species settle into a kind of balance, not static but finely tuned. Each organism exists within a network of relationships that holds it close to a functional center. Stray too far from that center, and survival becomes unlikely. This long-term balance creates what can be thought of as an equilibrium, not a perfect stillness, but a steady state shaped by constant correction. Variations still occur, but most are filtered out before they can spread widely. The system maintains itself through pressure, keeping species aligned with the demands of their environment. Time, in this process, stretches far beyond ordinary experience. The transformations that define evolution do not unfold within a lifetime or even a series of lifetimes. They require thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of generations, each contributing a small shift that only becomes visible when viewed from a great distance. Within such timescales, the mainland becomes a place of continuity. Its rules are deeply established, its pressures familiar to the species that inhabit it. Life there evolves within boundaries that have been reinforced again and again. When those boundaries are suddenly removed or rearranged, the balance no longer holds in the same way. The system that once kept species within narrow limits begins to loosen. The familiar pressures fade or change, and in that quiet shift, the conditions that once guided evolution are replaced by something entirely different. It is at that moment, when an organism leaves behind the steady rhythm it was shaped by, that the process begins to move in directions rarely seen elsewhere. An island begins as an absence, a stretch of land surrounded by water, empty not by design, but by separation. No footprints mark its surface at first. No calls echo through its air. Every living thing that will ever exist there must arrive from somewhere else, carried by chance, by shifting earth, or by forces that do not pause to notice what they transport. The paths that lead life to these isolated places are few, and each leaves a lasting imprint on what follows. Some journeys begin on open water, where distance is not crossed by intention, but by accident. A branch torn from a riverbank drifts outward, tangled with roots and soil, carrying with it small passengers clinging unseen. Storms sweep birds far beyond familiar skies, depositing them where land appears as an unexpected interruption in the sea. In rare moments, animals swim farther than their instincts would normally allow, driven by currents or necessity, arriving exhausted on shores they were never meant to reach. Such crossings are uncommon, sometimes occurring only once in the history of a species. Yet their rarity gives them weight. When only a handful of individuals step onto an island, they carry with them a narrow slice of the genetic variation found in their larger population. This small beginning shapes everything that follows. Traits that were once minor or infrequent can become the foundation of an entire lineage, simply because they were present at the moment of arrival. From this quiet narrowing emerges what is known as the founder effect. The future population grows from a limited set of inherited possibilities, its direction influenced as much by chance as by necessity. The island does not receive a full representation of the species, only a fragment, and that fragment becomes the starting point for all change that comes after. There are other routes, slower and less visible, written into the shifting patterns of the planet itself. During colder periods, vast amounts of water become locked within ice, and the level of the oceans falls. Land that was once submerged rises into continuity, forming temporary bridges between places that now stand apart. Across these connections, animals move freely, unaware that their path will not remain open. When the climate warms and the ice retreats, the sea returns, covering the bridges and leaving behind populations that no longer have a way back. These stranded groups carry with them a fuller range of variation than those arriving by chance across water. Yet they too find themselves enclosed within new boundaries. The connection that once linked them to the wider world disappears, and with it the steady exchange that had kept their traits aligned with distant relatives. Some islands, however, begin with nothing at all. Rising from the ocean floor through volcanic activity, they emerge as entirely new landscapes, untouched by any prior life. Their surfaces cool and settle, awaiting the first arrivals. Every plant, every insect, every bird that will one day inhabit such a place must cross open water to reach it. No land bridge has ever connected them. No prior population has existed to prepare the ground. On these islands, the sequence of arrival becomes especially significant. The earliest colonizers encounter an environment without established competition, shaping the conditions for those that follow. Each new arrival enters a space already altered by those who came before, creating a layered history that unfolds over long spans of time. No matter the path taken, every species that reaches an island steps into a setting unlike the one it left behind. The familiar pressures that once guided its existence are altered or removed, replaced by a quieter, more constrained world. In that shift, the process that has always been at work begins to move along new lines, guided by the circumstances of isolation. In the middle of the 20th century, patterns that had long existed in scattered observations were gathered into a single quiet realization. A Canadian biologist, J. Bristol Foster, studied mammals living on islands across the world, drawing together data from places separated by oceans, climates, and histories. What emerged from his work was not a collection of curiosities, but a consistent shift that appeared again and again, regardless of where he looked. By 1964, after examining 116 species, the pattern had taken a clear shape. Large animals, once established on islands, tended to become smaller over generations. Small animals, placed in the same condition of isolation, often moved in the opposite direction, increasing in size. The contrast was steady enough to resist dismissal, appearing across rodents, hoofed mammals, predators, and insect-eating species alike. This observation did not depend on a single lineage or a specific environment. It appeared in cold regions and warm ones, on islands near continents, and those far removed. The direction of change remained the same, suggesting that something about isolation itself was guiding these outcomes. The pattern came to be known as Foster's Rule, and later, more broadly, as the Island Rule. Decades later, as more data accumulated and methods of analysis became more refined, the pattern was tested again at a much larger scale. In 2021, a comprehensive study brought together information from over 1,000 vertebrate species, including mammals, birds, and reptiles. The result did not weaken the earlier observation. Instead, it reinforced it, showing that size shifts under island conditions followed the same general direction across a wide range of life forms. Within this pattern, two processes describe the movement of body size. Insular dwarfism refers to the reduction of large species after they become isolated, a gradual shift towards smaller forms across generations. Insular gigantism describes the opposite trajectory, where small species expand in size, often reaching dimensions not seen in their mainland relatives. These changes are not abrupt transformations, but slow adjustments that accumulate over long spans of time. The scale of these shifts can be striking. On certain Mediterranean islands, elephants that once belonged to some of the largest land animals known were reduced to a fraction of their former mass, sometimes less than 1/10 of what their ancestors carried. Their bodies, reshaped by conditions of confinement and limited resources, became compact and efficient in ways that would not persist in more expansive environments. At the other end of the spectrum, small mammals have shown a tendency to grow beyond their usual limits. The field mouse of St. Kilda, living on a remote island off the coast of Scotland, reached roughly twice the mass of its mainland counterpart. This change did not arise from a different ancestry, but from the same lineage adjusting to a different set of circumstances, guided by pressures that favored a larger form. What emerges from these observations is not randomness, but a directional response that repeats across different branches of life. Body size, one of the most fundamental traits an organism possesses, becomes flexible under isolation, shifting in ways that follow a consistent pattern. The same process that once held size within a narrow range begins to allow movement outward toward new balances shaped by unfamiliar conditions. The pattern stands as a quiet constant, appearing wherever isolation takes hold and persists over time. Stone holds its memory differently from living things. In layers of sediment and mineral, entire histories settle without urgency, preserving shapes that no longer walk the earth. Among those preserved forms are elephants that do not match expectation, their bones scaled down in ways that seem almost improbable until the pattern behind them becomes clear. During the Pleistocene, the Mediterranean basin did not resemble the stable arrangement seen today. Shorelines shifted with the rhythm of advancing and retreating ice, exposing land and then reclaiming it. Islands emerged, merged, and separated again, creating a shifting mosaic of isolation. Through these changing pathways, elephants repeatedly entered regions that would later become detached fragments of land. Once separated, their descendants began to diverge. On Malta and Sicily, one lineage produced Paleoloxodon menadriensis, an elephant that stood around 1.8 meters at the shoulder. Its ancestor, Paleoloxodon antiquus, had towered up to 4 meters, a presence built for open landscapes and distant threats. The difference was not a slight adjustment, but a substantial transformation, reducing body mass to a small fraction of what had once defined the species. Another lineage moved even further along this path. Elephas falconeri, also found on Malta and Sicily, reached a height of roughly 90 centimeters. Its proportions place it closer to the scale of a large dog than to the giants it descended from. Despite this reduction, the fossil record shows no signs of immaturity. Growth plates are fully fused, and the teeth display patterns of wear consistent with adulthood. These were not young individuals frozen in development, but complete organisms whose entire life cycle unfolded at this smaller size. The conditions that shaped these changes were neither abrupt nor chaotic. They arose from the quiet constraints of island life. Large predators were absent, removing the need for size as a form of defense. Without the presence of lions, hyenas, or other large hunters, the advantage of maintaining massive bulk diminished. The energy required to sustain such size no longer yielded a clear return. At the same time, the available resources were limited. Islands offer finite vegetation, confined within boundaries that do not expand. A large body demands a constant intake of energy, and in an environment where food supply cannot meet that demand, smaller forms become more viable. Individuals requiring fewer resources can persist through periods of scarcity, reproducing under conditions that would challenge larger counterparts. Across generations, these pressures shaped the population. Each slight reduction in size that improved survival was carried forward, gradually shifting the average body form. The process did not move with visible speed, yet in geological terms it occurred relatively quickly. Estimates suggest that significant size reduction could take place within a few thousand generations, a brief interval when measured against the longer history of the species. The result was not a diminished version of the elephant, but a form adjusted to its environment with precision. Every aspect of its body, from bone structure to metabolic demand, aligned with the constraints of the island it inhabited. The transformation reflects not loss but refinement, guided by conditions that favored efficiency over scale. These dwarf elephants persisted for extended periods, occupying their environments as fully adapted inhabitants. Their existence came to an end roughly 11,000 years ago, a point that aligns with the arrival of humans in the region. The timing suggests a convergence of pressures beyond those that had shaped them for millennia, marking a final shift in a long and quiet history recorded in stone. Size carries a cost that is easy to overlook when space and resources seem endless. A large body is not only a presence, it is a constant demand, a quiet requirement for energy that must be met day after day. In environments where that demand can be satisfied without strain, size becomes sustainable. When the boundaries tighten, the same scale begins to weigh against survival. On an island, the limits are already set. Land does not extend beyond its edges, and the plants that grow upon it are confined to what the soil and climate can support. Seasons may pass with abundance, but there are also intervals when food becomes scarce, and during those times, every organism must draw from what is available within that fixed space. A smaller body requires fewer calories to maintain, allowing it to endure periods that place larger individuals under strain. Over many generations, those that can persist through these lean intervals leave behind more descendants, and the average size of the population begins to shift. Another influence works more quietly, rooted not in scarcity but in absence. On larger landmasses, size often serves as a form of protection. A substantial body can deter predators, reduce vulnerability, or allow an animal to withstand an encounter that might otherwise be fatal. When those predators are no longer present, the need for such defenses fades. The energy that once supported mass, muscle, and protective structure no longer contributes to survival in the same way. Maintaining that investment becomes costly without providing a corresponding advantage. At the same time, the rhythm of life begins to adjust. Smaller individuals tend to mature more quickly, reaching reproductive age sooner than their larger counterparts. In environments where resources are limited, this shift carries weight. The ability to reproduce earlier and more frequently allows traits associated with reduced size to spread more rapidly through the population. Over successive generations, this change in timing alters the life history of the species, favoring shorter intervals between birth and reproduction. On expansive continents, many large animals follow a slower pattern. They grow over extended periods, reproduce less frequently, and invest heavily in each offspring. This approach, often described as K-selection, is well suited to stable conditions where competition is intense and survival depends on maintaining a consistent presence within a crowded system. In contrast, the pressures of an island can favor a different balance, one that leans toward earlier reproduction and lighter investment per generation, allowing populations to adjust more fluidly to fluctuating conditions. Alongside these pressures, chance also plays a role. When only a small number of individuals establish a new population, the range of genetic variation is limited from the beginning. Traits that might have been rare in the original population can become more common simply because they were present in those initial individuals. This process, known as genetic drift, can amplify certain characteristics without regard to their broader context, interacting with environmental pressures to shape the direction of change. Through the combined influence of limited resources, reduced predation, altered reproductive timing, and the randomness of small populations, the trajectory of body size moves steadily downward. The process is gradual, unfolding across generations that each carry a slight adjustment forward. What emerges is not a weakened form, but one aligned with its surroundings. The reduction in size reflects a recalibration, a shift toward a state where energy use, growth, and reproduction are balanced within the constraints of the environment. In this sense, the change is not a loss, but a refinement guided by conditions that favor precision over scale. Heat settles into the ground long before anything moves across it. On certain islands in Indonesia, the air itself seems to rest against the surface, holding a stillness that is broken only when something large shifts through the brush. What appears is not a relic from a distant age, but a living animal, built with a scale that feels out of place until its surroundings are understood. The Komodo dragon, Varanus komodoensis, is the largest living lizard, reaching lengths of up to 3 meters and weights approaching 70 kilograms. Its range is narrow, confined to 5 islands: Komodo, Rinca, Flores, Gili, Motang, and Padar. Beyond these boundaries, it does not exist in the wild, its presence held within a small archipelago where conditions allowed it to become what it is. Its lineage does not begin at this size. Fossil evidence traced back to Australia, dating to around 3.8 million years ago, shows that its ancestors were part of a broader group of monitor lizards, none of which approached the scale seen today. These earlier forms dispersed westward, crossing into what would become the Indonesian islands. Once there, their descendants encountered a different set of conditions, and the trajectory of their bodies began to shift. The environment they entered did not constrain them in the same way as the mainland. Competition for large prey was reduced, leaving ecological space that would otherwise be occupied by established predators. At the same time, sizable prey animals were present, including dwarf elephants that once inhabited these islands. This combination created an unusual balance, one where increasing body size offered access to resources without the usual limitations imposed by rival species or larger hunters. Across generations, individuals that could reach greater size gained an advantage. Larger bodies allowed them to subdue more substantial prey, to travel greater distances in search of food, and to maintain dominance within their environment. Without a higher predator to restrict their growth, there was little to counter this upward shift. Size, instead of being capped by competition, became a pathway toward occupying the top position within the island's food structure. The physical form that emerged reflects this role. The Komodo dragon's teeth are serrated, capable of cutting through flesh with efficiency. Its claws provide both traction and force, anchoring it as it moves or restrains prey. Beneath these visible features lies another adaptation, venom that interferes with blood clotting, ensuring that even a single wound can lead to significant loss over time. The animal does not rely on a single mechanism, but on a combination of traits that together allow it to overcome prey much larger than itself. Its hunting behavior follows this design. A strike may be brief, but its effects extend beyond the initial contact. The prey, weakened by injury and blood loss, becomes increasingly vulnerable, and the dragon follows, patient and deliberate, until the outcome is certain. In this way, it occupies a position that would typically belong to entirely different kinds of predators. What emerges in this animal is not an exaggeration, but a response. The same process that reduced size in other contexts here moves in the opposite direction, guided by a landscape that offered opportunity rather than limitation. The absence of competing large predators, combined with the availability of substantial prey, created conditions where increasing size was not only possible but advantageous. Within that narrow set of islands, evolution worked with what was available, shaping a predator from a lineage that began at a smaller scale. The result is a form that appears singular, yet it follows the same underlying pattern, responding to isolation with a change that aligns precisely with the environment it inhabits. A small body is often shaped by caution. On expansive land, where threats come from many directions, remaining small allows an animal to pass unnoticed, to slip through spaces that larger forms cannot occupy. This size is not an accident, but a response, refined over generations in landscapes where survival depends on avoiding attention. When those pressures fall away, the purpose of smallness begins to loosen. On many islands, the range of predators is reduced or absent entirely. The constant need to hide, to remain quick and inconspicuous, loses its urgency. Without that pressure, the advantages of being small begin to fade, and with them, the constraints that once held size within narrow limits. Energy that would have been spent on vigilance and concealment can now support growth. A larger body offers different possibilities. It allows an animal to move across wider areas in search of food, to reach resources that were previously inaccessible, and to occupy a more dominant position within its environment. The shift does not occur all at once, but gradually, as individuals that grow slightly larger find themselves better suited to the conditions they now inhabit. Competition also changes in these confined landscapes. On continents, small animals exist, alongside many other species that share similar diets and habitats. Each must carve out a narrow role, limited by the presence of others. On an island with fewer species, those boundaries expand. A small herbivore, for example, may find itself among the largest animals present, free to exploit a wider range of plants. As it grows larger, it can process tougher materials, travel farther between feeding sites, and exert greater control over its surroundings. This expansion of opportunity encourages an increase in size, not as excess, but as a response to available space within the ecological structure. The animal begins to occupy roles that would be filled by entirely different species elsewhere, its body adjusting to meet those demands. Temperature can also influence this direction of change. On islands where conditions are cooler, a larger body helps retain heat more effectively. The relationship between surface area and volume favors those with greater mass, allowing them to conserve energy that would otherwise be lost. Over time, this advantage contributes to a gradual increase in size, aligning the organism more closely with the thermal conditions of its environment. These influences together form what is often described as ecological release. The limitations that once defined an animal's form are lifted or altered, allowing its characteristics to move toward a different balance. The body is no longer confined by the same network of pressures, and in that freedom, it adjusts to what the new environment supports. Research drawing from a wide range of species has shown that this pattern is not isolated. A comprehensive study in 2021 examined over 1,000 vertebrate species and found consistent evidence that reduced predation and competition play central roles in driving this increase in size among smaller animals. The pattern appears across different groups, suggesting a shared mechanism rather than a series of unrelated outcomes. What emerges is a symmetry that mirrors the reduction seen in larger species. The direction of change differs, but the underlying process remains consistent. The environment sets new conditions, and the body shifts accordingly, guided by the same gradual filtering of variation across generations. Within these enclosed worlds, size becomes flexible, responding to the specific demands placed upon it. The change is neither arbitrary nor chaotic. It follows a logic shaped by absence and opportunity, where the form of an animal reflects the balance of forces acting upon it, even when those forces differ from anything found beyond the island's edge. In a humid forest on an island in the Indian Ocean, there once lived a bird that had no reason to hurry. Its movements were steady, unguarded, shaped by a world where urgency had long since faded from necessity. Nothing in its surroundings demanded constant vigilance, and over long stretches of time, that absence became part of its design. The dodo, Rhaphis cucullatus, has come to be remembered as something lesser than it was, often reduced to a symbol detached from its origins. Yet the animal itself was neither crude nor poorly formed. It was a product of extended refinement, a species shaped with precision by the conditions of Mauritius, an island that offered stability without the pressures found elsewhere. Its ancestry traces back to a flying pigeon, closely related to the Nicobar pigeon of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Genetic analysis conducted in 2002 confirmed this relationship, linking the dodo to a lineage defined by flight and mobility. At some point in the distant past, a small population reached Mauritius, crossing open water to settle in a place where familiar constraints no longer applied. On this island, there were no mammalian predators. The sky and ground offered no persistent threats that would require escape through flight. Over many generations, the structures and muscles that supported flight became less essential. Energy once devoted to maintaining those capabilities was redirected. Wings diminished, and the body grew heavier, shifting toward a form that no longer relied on leaving the ground. As its size increased, other features followed. The dodo reached a height of roughly 1 meter and a weight between 10 and 18 kilograms. Its beak became large and curved, suited to handling the seeds and fallen fruit that made up its diet. Each aspect of its body aligned with the resources available, forming a bird adapted to foraging on the forest floor without the need for speed or concealment. Its behavior reflected the same history. Without generations of exposure to mammalian predators, there was no foundation for fear of such creatures. The responses that might have been present in its ancestors did not persist, as they were never required. Over time, this absence became embedded in the species, shaping how it moved through its environment and how it reacted to unfamiliar presence. When humans arrived on Mauritius in 1598, they encountered a bird that did not retreat. Accounts describe individuals that approached rather than fled, their behavior guided by a world that had never presented them with a comparable threat. The change introduced by human arrival was immediate in its impact, though not in its recognition by the species itself. Within a relatively short span, the dodo disappeared. The last confirmed sighting occurred in 1662, less than 65 years after sustained contact began. The factors behind its extinction were multiple, including direct hunting and the introduction of other animals that altered the island's ecology. Yet underlying these events was a deeper condition, one rooted in the same process that had shaped the bird over millions of years. The dodo was not unfit. It was precisely suited to the environment in which it evolved. Its form and behavior reflected a balance that had held for a long time. When that environment changed suddenly, the traits that had once ensured its survival no longer aligned with the new conditions. The absence of fear, once neutral or even advantageous, became a liability. In this, the dodo reveals a quieter aspect of isolation. The same process that allows life to settle into a refined balance also narrows its range of response. Adaptation, in this sense, carries a form of specificity that binds a species to the conditions it has known, leaving it less able to adjust when those conditions shift abruptly. The story held within this bird is not one of deficiency, but of alignment meeting disruption, where a form shaped with care over time encounters a world it was never built to face. Feathers are often associated with motion, with lift and distance, with the ability to leave the ground behind. Yet in certain places, feathers remain while flight itself fades away, becoming something no longer required. Across many isolated landscapes, birds have followed this quiet transition, exchanging the sky for the ground in ways that repeat with striking consistency. This change has occurred not once, but many times. Flightlessness has evolved independently on islands at least 30 separate times, appearing in lineages that share no recent connection. The repetition suggests that the shift is not an anomaly, but a response to a specific set of conditions that appear wherever isolation removes familiar constraints. Flight is an intricate and demanding ability. It requires powerful muscles anchored to a reinforced skeleton, lightweight bones structured for lift, and a cardiovascular system capable of sustaining intense exertion. Maintaining this system consumes a significant portion of an animal's energy. On continents, that cost is balanced by the advantages flight provides: escape from predators, access to distant resources, and the ability to move quickly across changing environments. On islands where ground predators are absent, these advantages lose their urgency. The need to escape diminishes, and the energy required to sustain flight begins to outweigh its benefits. Over generations, individuals that allocate less energy to flight and more to other functions gain a subtle advantage. The structures that once supported flight become reduced, and the body shifts toward a different balance. This redirection of energy allows for other developments. Growth can increase, reproductive output can expand, and foraging behaviors can become more specialized. The transformation does not remove feathers or wings entirely, but alters their purpose, turning them into remnants of a capacity that is no longer central to survival. In New Zealand, this process produced birds that seem to belong to a different category altogether. The kiwi, roughly the size of a chicken, moves through forest undergrowth with a posture more often associated with mammals. Its nostrils, positioned at the tip of its beak, allow it to detect food within the soil, guiding its movements in darkness. Over millions of years without land mammals, it adopted roles that would elsewhere be filled by entirely different forms of life. Another New Zealand species, the kakapo, followed a related path. It is the heaviest parrot in the world, flightless and active at night. Its life unfolds on the ground, where it forages and nests in an environment that once lacked terrestrial predators. Its longevity, often exceeding 90 years, reflects a life history shaped by stability rather than constant threat. On Madagascar, the same absence of ground predators allowed for an even more dramatic expansion in size. The elephant birds, belonging to the genus Apiornis, reached heights of up to 3 meters and weights approaching 730 kilograms. These were the largest birds known to have existed, their scale far beyond what flight would allow. Their eggs, measuring up to 34 centimeters in length and holding around 9 liters of liquid, remain the largest produced by any vertebrate. Each of these cases developed independently, shaped by local conditions yet guided by the same underlying pressures. The removal of predation and the availability of resources allowed energy to be directed away from flight and toward growth and specialization. Flightlessness, in this context, is not a loss in the ordinary sense. It is a reallocation, a shift in how energy is used and what traits are favored. The wings remain, but their role changes, becoming part of a body designed for a different set of demands. Across these islands, the repeated emergence of ground-dwelling birds reflects a consistent response to isolation. The air remains above them, unchanged, yet the necessity to reach it has quietly disappeared, leaving behind forms that carry the memory of flight within structures that no longer require it. Far in the southern Pacific, a landmass drifted into isolation long before most familiar ecosystems had taken shape. Around 85 million years ago, New Zealand separated from the remnants of Gondwana, carrying with it a fragment of ancient life into a prolonged separation. At that time, placental mammals had not yet spread widely across the continents, and so this land moved forward largely without them. Over tens of millions of years, this absence became a defining condition. Where other regions developed alongside a wide array of mammals, New Zealand remained a place where such forms were almost entirely missing. The roles typically filled by grazing herbivores, burrowing foragers, and small insect hunters did not remain empty. Instead, birds expanded into these spaces, diversifying in ways that reshaped the structure of the entire ecosystem. Without competition from mammals, birds occupied positions that elsewhere would seem improbable. They became ground dwellers, browsers, and large herbivores, adapting their bodies to tasks far removed from flight. The boundaries that usually constrain avian forms loosened, allowing a wider range of sizes and behaviors to emerge. Among the most striking of these were the moa, a group of 9 species that varied from smaller, turkey-like birds to forms of immense scale. The largest, Dinornis robustus, stood approximately 3.6 meters tall, making it the tallest bird confirmed by fossil evidence. Unlike many other flightless birds, the moa lacked wings entirely, not even retaining reduced structures. Their bodies showed no trace of the appendages that once defined their ancestors, reflecting a complete shift away from flight over a long evolutionary history. These birds moved through forests and open areas as primary herbivores, shaping vegetation patterns through their feeding. In the absence of mammalian grazers, they became the dominant large plant consumers, their size and numbers influencing the structure of the landscape itself. Predation, too, followed a different path. The only significant land predator before human arrival was the Haast's eagle, Hieraitis mori. Its existence reflects the same pattern of adaptation seen in its prey. Descended from a much smaller eagle from Australia, likely weighing around 1 kilogram, it evolved into a form reaching up to 15 kilograms with a wingspan extending to approximately 3 meters. This increase in size was not incidental. The abundance of large, flightless birds provided an opportunity for a predator capable of exploiting that resource. Over time, individuals with greater mass and strength were favored, allowing them to hunt animals far larger than typical avian prey. The eagle's body adapted accordingly, becoming one of the largest known birds of prey. Together, the moa and the Haast's eagle illustrate a system that reorganized itself in response to long-term isolation. Instead of individual species adjusting within a broader framework, the entire structure of the ecosystem shifted. Birds assumed roles across multiple levels, from primary consumers to apex predators, forming a network that differed fundamentally from those shaped by mammals. This arrangement persisted for millions of years, maintaining a balance that was internally consistent. The interactions between species, the distribution of energy, and the flow of resources, all aligned within this distinct framework, sustained by the absence of external influences. The arrival of humans in the period between 1300 and 1440 marked a rapid change. Within roughly 100 years, both the moa and the Haast's eagle disappeared. The factors leading to their extinction included direct hunting and habitat alteration, but the speed of the loss reflects how closely the system was tied to its original conditions. New Zealand, in this context, stands as a record of how isolation can extend beyond individual traits to shape entire ecosystems. The absence of one group allowed another to expand, filling roles in ways that followed the same underlying processes seen elsewhere, but expressed across a broader scale. Off the coast of what is now California, a chain of islands holds a quieter record, one written not in scattered fragments, but in a sequence clear enough to trace change as it unfolds. Within these deposits, the transformation of a large animal into a smaller form can be followed step by step, preserved across layers that mark time with unusual precision. During the Pleistocene, the distance between mainland and island was not as it appears today. Lower sea levels brought the Channel Islands closer to the continent, narrowing the stretch of water that separated them. Columbian mammoths, Mammothus columbi, moved into this region, and at some point, individuals crossed the remaining gap, likely by swimming. Their arrival was not a continuous flow, but a limited event, leaving a small population isolated from the larger mainland group. On the continent, these mammoths stood up to 4 meters tall and could weigh as much as 10 tons. Their size reflected the demands and opportunities of an expansive environment. On the islands, the conditions were different. Space was confined, vegetation limited, and the pressures that once supported such scale were no longer present. Over time, their descendants became Mammothus exilis, the Pygmy mammoth. This form stood between 1.4 and 1.8 meters tall and weighed around 760 kilograms. The reduction brought their mass to less than 1/10 of their mainland ancestors. The change did not occur in a single leap, but through gradual shifts carried across generations. The fossil record from the Channel Islands provides a rare continuity, allowing these stages to be observed rather than inferred. Bones from different periods reveal intermediate sizes, forms that sit between the large mainland mammoth and the later pygmy version. This sequence offers a view of insular dwarfism as a process, unfolding through time rather than appearing only as a completed outcome. Evidence places the presence of these pygmy mammoths between approximately 80,000 and 13,000 years ago. Within that span, the reduction in size is estimated to have occurred over roughly 5,000 to 20,000 years. In geological terms, this is a brief interval, a rapid adjustment shaped by the pressures of the island environment. Those pressures were consistent. No large predators occupied the islands during this period, removing any need for size as a defensive measure. Resources remained limited, reinforcing the advantage of a smaller body that could subsist on what the landscape provided. Each generation reflected these conditions, carrying forward traits that aligned with the constraints of the setting. The absence of predation and the presence of limited food formed a stable framework in which the smaller form could persist. Within this framework, the pygmy mammoth occupied its place as a primary herbivore, shaping and being shaped by the vegetation it consumed. Around 13,000 years ago, this lineage came to an end. The timing corresponds with the arrival of humans in the region and significant climatic changes at the close of the last ice age. These combined influences altered the conditions that had sustained the population, introducing factors that the species had not encountered during its long period of isolation. What remains in the fossil record is not only the final form, but the path that led to it. The Channel Islands provide a detailed account of how size can shift under constrained conditions, preserving a sequence that reveals the gradual nature of the change. In these layers, the process of insular dwarfism becomes visible, traced through bones that mark each stage of a transformation guided by the limits of a small and contained world. Where sunlight settles longest, another kind of transformation takes hold, one that follows a different rhythm from that of warm-blooded animals. Reptiles, shaped by a metabolism that draws directly from external heat, move through their environments with an economy that alters how size is balanced against survival. Unlike mammals and birds, reptiles do not maintain a constant internal temperature. Their bodies warm and cool with the surroundings, reducing the energy required to sustain basic functions. This difference carries profound consequences. A reptile of considerable size does not demand the same continuous intake of food as a similarly sized mammal. The cost of being large is lower, allowing growth to extend into ranges that might otherwise be unsustainable in confined environments. On islands, this advantage becomes especially visible. Limited resources that would restrict the expansion of warm-blooded animals do not impose the same constraints on reptiles. With fewer calories needed per unit of body mass, larger forms can persist without exceeding what the environment can provide. Over time, this balance allows size to increase in ways that appear disproportionate when compared to mainland relatives. The Galapagos tortoise, part of the Chelonoidus niger species complex, stands as one of the most prominent examples. Individuals can exceed 400 kilograms and live for more than 170 years, making them among the longest-lived vertebrates known. Their ancestors were far smaller tortoises from South America, which reached the islands approximately 2 to 3 million years ago. Once established, their descendants encountered conditions that favored expansion rather than restraint. Vegetation was available, and no large mammalian predators were present to challenge them. Under these circumstances, larger size offered multiple advantages. A greater reach allowed access to a wider range of plants, including those higher above the ground. Increased body mass supported water retention, a valuable trait in environments where moisture could vary. Size also influenced interactions between individuals, shaping access to territory and resources. As generations passed, these pressures guided the tortoises toward a larger form. The result was not uniform across all islands. Different locations produced variations in shell shape and overall size, reflecting local conditions such as vegetation type, terrain, and climate. Some tortoises developed domed shells, suited to grazing on low plants, while others evolved saddle-backed forms that allowed them to extend their necks upward. Each variation represents a response to the specific demands of a particular island, illustrating how isolation can produce distinct outcomes even within closely related groups. A similar transformation occurred far from the Galapagos in the Indian Ocean, where the Aldabra giant tortoise followed its own path toward large size. This lineage is unrelated to the Galapagos tortoises, yet the outcome mirrors it closely. On Aldabra, the same absence of large predators and the availability of vegetation created conditions that favored increased body mass. Over time, this separate lineage arrived at a comparable solution shaped by similar pressures acting in a different place. This convergence carries significance beyond the individual species involved. When unrelated lineages, separated by vast distances, arrive at similar forms under comparable conditions, it points to a consistent underlying mechanism. The environment sets the parameters, and within those parameters, evolution moves in predictable directions. Reptiles, with their energy-efficient physiology, reveal this pattern with particular clarity. Their ability to sustain larger bodies under limited resources allows the process to extend further than it might in other groups, producing forms that stand out in both scale and longevity. Across these islands, the presence of giant tortoises is not an isolated occurrence, but part of a broader pattern. The same conditions, repeated in different locations, guide different lineages towards similar outcomes. In this, the shaping of life follows a steady logic, where the characteristics of the environment are reflected in the bodies of the organisms that inhabit it. In the South Atlantic, far from major landmasses, a small volcanic island rises from the ocean, surrounded by distances that rarely allow anything to arrive by chance. Gough Island sits roughly 2,700 kilometers from the nearest continent, its isolation shaping every living system that has taken hold upon it. Unlike many examples preserved only in ancient remains, what unfolds here can be observed directly, still in motion. The story begins not with a native species, but with an arrival carried unintentionally by human activity. In the 19th century, sealing ships reached the island, and among the cargo were house mice, Mus musculus, hidden within supplies and structure. The number of individuals was likely small, a handful that stepped into an environment without the pressures that had shaped their ancestors. From that limited beginning, a new population formed. Over time, the mice of Gough Island diverged from their mainland relatives in ways that reflect the conditions they encountered. Today, they are approximately twice the body size of typical house mice, placing them among the largest wild representatives of their species. This increase did not require long spans of geological time. It unfolded within roughly 200 years, a brief interval when measured against most evolutionary changes. The shift in size is accompanied by a change in behavior that has no parallel in mainland populations. These mice have become active predators of seabird chicks, including those of the Tristan albatross. The chicks can weigh many times more than the mice, yet they do not respond with defense or escape. The mice approach and feed on them while they are still alive, a pattern that would not emerge in environments where such prey had evolved alongside small terrestrial predators. This behavior is not inherited from distant ancestors. It developed within the island environment, shaped by the absence of competitors and the availability of an abundant, unprotected food source. The seabirds themselves evolved in a setting without land-based threats of this kind. Their nesting habits and responses reflect that history, lacking the mechanisms that might deter or avoid such attacks. In this interaction, two separate evolutionary paths meet. The mice, freed from the constraints that once defined their role, expand into a new position within the food structure. The birds, shaped by a long absence of similar pressures, remain unprepared for this change. The result is a dynamic that is currently altering the balance of the island's ecosystem. The impact is significant. Multiple seabird species are experiencing population declines, driven in part by predation from the mice. What began as a small, unintended introduction has grown into a force capable of reshaping the community of the island, illustrating how quickly such processes can unfold when conditions allow. This case offers a view of the island rule not as a distant pattern inferred from bones, but as an active process. The same principles that guided changes in ancient species are visible here within a time frame that overlaps with recorded human history. Size shifts and behavioral changes emerge together, reflecting the combined influence of isolation, limited competition, and available resources. Gough Island stands as a place where the mechanisms of evolution can be observed without the distance of deep time. The transformation of its mice reveals how rapidly life can adjust when placed within a confined and altered environment, demonstrating that the patterns seen across islands are not confined to the past, but continue wherever the same conditions take hold. Roots move slowly, yet their reach defines the shape of entire landscapes. In places where isolation settles in, even organisms that do not move in the ordinary sense begin to change, responding to the same quiet pressures that reshape animals. The patterns seen in fur and bone find their parallel in stems, leaves, and bark, unfolding across generations in ways that mirror the logic of confinement. The island rule is most often described through animals, where shifts in size and behavior are easier to trace. Yet plants, anchored in place, experience the same altered conditions. Limited space, reduced competition, and the absence of familiar threats influence their form just as steadily, guiding their growth toward new balances. One of the clearest expressions of this process is known as island woodiness. On continents, many plant species remain small and flexible, growing as herbs that complete their life cycles quickly. On islands, these same lineages often transition into trees or shrubs, developing thicker stems and longer lifespans. This transformation has occurred independently across multiple groups, suggesting a consistent response to similar conditions. The Galapagos daisy tree, belonging to the genus Scalesia, illustrates this shift with particular clarity. Its ancestors were small, soft-stemmed plants resembling ordinary daisies. After reaching the islands, their descendants grew into tree-like forms that can reach heights of up to 15 meters. The change reflects a reallocation of resources where energy once directed toward rapid reproduction is instead invested in structure and longevity. In these environments, growing taller offers distinct advantages. Without dense forests dominated by large trees, the competition for light follows a different pattern. A plant that extends upward can access sunlight more directly, spreading its leaves above surrounding vegetation. The absence of towering competitors allows this growth to proceed without the constraints found on the mainland, where established canopies limit vertical expansion. At the same time, other island conditions push in the opposite direction. On smaller landmasses with thin soils and strong winds, some plants reduce their size, forming compact structures that resist environmental stress. These forms conserve resources and maintain stability, illustrating that the direction of change depends on the specific combination of pressures present in each location. Defensive traits also shift in response to isolation. On continents, many plants produce thorns, toxins, or bitter compounds to deter herbivores. These features require energy to maintain, and when the animals they defend against are absent, that energy can be redirected elsewhere. Over generations, these defenses diminish or disappear, leaving plants that are more vulnerable but also less burdened by unnecessary traits. When new herbivores arrive, often introduced by humans, the consequences become clear. Plants that have lost their defenses are consumed rapidly, lacking the means to resist grazing. The change is not a failure of adaptation, but a reflection of the conditions under which they evolved, where such protections were no longer required. This pattern echoes changes seen in animal behavior, where responses to predators fade in their absence. In both cases, traits that no longer serve a purpose are not maintained. Evolution does not preserve features without function. It adjusts continuously, favoring efficiency over redundancy. Across island ecosystems, plants reveal that the principles shaping life under isolation extend beyond movement and behavior. Growth patterns, structural forms, and chemical defenses all respond to the same set of altered conditions. The resulting diversity reflects not randomness, but a consistent alignment between organism and environment, where each form emerges as a precise answer to the constraints and opportunities of a bounded world. Close to the ground, where movement is quieter and often overlooked, another version of the same pattern unfolds. In these lower layers of the living world, size carries a different meaning, yet the pressures that shape it remain consistent. When isolation takes hold, even the smallest creatures begin to shift beyond their usual limits. Invertebrates respond to these conditions with a clarity that can feel unexpected. Without the constant presence of predators, and with fewer competitors occupying similar roles, their bodies are free to expand into ranges rarely seen elsewhere. The result is a form of gigantism that stands out not only because of its scale, but because it emerges in organisms that are typically associated with smallness. In New Zealand, where land mammals were absent for vast stretches of time, this shift becomes especially visible. The giant weta, belonging to the genus Dinocreta, reaches sizes that place it among the largest insects known. Some individuals weigh up to 70 grams, surpassing the mass of a small bird. Their presence on the forest floor reflects a broader reorganization of ecological roles. In environments where mammals would normally occupy ground-level niches, these insects expanded to fill that space. They forage among vegetation, consuming plant material and organic matter, performing functions similar to those of rodents and shrews on other landmasses. Their size supports this role, allowing them to process a wider range of food and move across their habitat with greater stability. This expansion did not occur because insects are inherently suited to become large, but because the usual constraints that limit their size were reduced. Without the pressures that typically restrict their growth, the balance between energy intake and body mass shifted, making larger forms sustainable within the boundaries of the island. A similar pattern appears in other isolated regions. In the Galapagos, the giant centipede, Scolopendra galapagoensis, reaches lengths of up to 43 centimeters. Its behavior extends beyond what is commonly associated with invertebrates, as it preys on birds, lizards, and small mammals. This role places it within a position in the food structure that would ordinarily be occupied by vertebrate predators. Across multiple island groups, spiders also exhibit consistent increases in size compared to their mainland relatives. The absence of larger competitors and the availability of prey allow them to extend their reach, both in physical scale and in the scope of their ecological role. Their webs and hunting strategies adapt alongside their size, forming part of a broader pattern that reflects the conditions of isolation. On Lord Howe Island, another example emerged after a long period of absence. The stick insect, Dryococelus australis, was once thought to be extinct, its disappearance attributed to environmental changes following human arrival. In 2001, it was rediscovered on a small sea stack nearby, a remnant population surviving in a confined space. These insects can grow up to 15 centimeters in length, their size standing in contrast to typical expectations for their group. In each of these cases, the underlying mechanism remains consistent. Reduced predation allows individuals to persist without the need for concealment or rapid escape. Reduced competition opens ecological space, enabling expansion into roles that are otherwise occupied. Together, these conditions create what can be described as a release from constraint, allowing body size to move beyond its usual limits. The pattern does not depend on lineage or classification. It appears in insects, arachnids, and other invertebrates, each responding in its own way to the same set of influences. The island rule, in this sense, extends across the full range of life, operating wherever isolation reshapes the balance of pressures that guide form and function. Predation carries its own demands, a balance between strength, speed, and the energy required to sustain both. On larger land masses, predators evolve in response to the size and behavior of their prey, their bodies shaped to match the scale of what they pursue. When that relationship is carried into isolation, the structure begins to shift in quieter, more subtle ways. On islands, large predators do not arrive into abundance. They enter environments where resources are limited and where the animals they hunt are themselves undergoing change. As prey species adjust to the constraints of a smaller world, often reducing in size, the predators that depend on them are drawn into the same process. A large hunter pursuing smaller prey carries an unnecessary burden, expending energy that the environment cannot easily replace. Over generations, this imbalance is corrected. Individuals that require less energy to survive, that can subsist on smaller meals, begin to hold an advantage. Their bodies become lighter, their demands reduced, aligning more closely with the scale of available food. The transformation is not abrupt, but steady, guided by the same pressures that shape herbivores under similar conditions. The island fox, Urocyon littoralis, offers a clear example. Found on the California Channel Islands, it descends from the gray fox of the mainland, an animal that can weigh up to 9 kilograms. On the islands, its descendant became significantly smaller, with a body mass ranging from roughly 1.3 to 2.8 kilograms. This reduction brings it to about 1/3 of its ancestral size. The shift reflects the nature of its prey. Instead of pursuing large animals, the island fox feeds on insects, small reptiles, birds, and plant material such as berries. These resources do not require the strength or endurance of a larger predator. A smaller body allows for more efficient use of energy, supporting survival within an environment where food is both varied and limited in quantity. In some cases, this adjustment occurs on both sides of the interaction. Herbivores and predators reduce in size together, maintaining a functional relationship at a smaller scale. This pattern, sometimes described as co-dwarfism, preserves the balance between hunter and prey while adapting it to the constraints of the island. Fossil records from Pleistocene Mediterranean islands reveal such systems where dwarf, hippos, elephants, and deer existed alongside reduced forms of their predators, each shaped by the same conditions. There are also islands where predators are absent entirely. In these environments, prey species evolve without the pressures that would normally shape their behavior and physiology. Defensive traits, both physical and behavioral, diminish over time. The vigilance required to detect and evade predators is no longer necessary, and so it fades from the population. The result is an animal that moves through its environment without the constant readiness that defines life under threat. When predators are present, their reduced form reflects the scale of what they hunt. When predators are absent, prey species shift in ways that remove the need for defense altogether. In both cases, the relationship between hunter and hunted is altered, not only in size, but in the entire set of traits that define their interaction. The island reshapes this relationship at every level. It adjusts the bodies of predators, the bodies of prey, and the behaviors that connect them. What remains is a system that continues to function, but in a form that reflects the limits and opportunities of a contained world, where every aspect of the interaction has been recalibrated to match the conditions of isolation. In a limestone chamber on the island of Flores, layers of sediment gathered over long intervals, holding within them traces of lives that moved through the space and then disappeared. In 2003, excavations at Liangbua Cave revealed something that did not fit easily into the established patterns of human ancestry. The remains belonged to a hominin, but one whose proportions and structure suggested a different path. Homo floresiensis, later given the informal name the Hobbit, stood approximately 1.1 meters tall. Its skull enclosed a brain roughly one-third the size of modern Homo sapiens. The combination of small stature and reduced cranial capacity placed it outside expectations, yet the bones showed no indication of immaturity. These were adult individuals, their bodies fully formed. Nearby, stone tools were found embedded within the same layers, dated to a range between approximately 190,000 and 50,000 years ago. The tools displayed patterns of shaping and use consistent with deliberate manufacture, indicating that the individuals associated with them engaged in behaviors commonly linked to larger-brained hominins. The presence of these artifacts suggests a continuity of activity extending across a substantial span of time. The prevailing interpretation places the origin of Homo floresiensis within a broader lineage that includes Homo erectus. On the mainland, Homo erectus reached heights of up to 1.8 meters, carrying a body adapted to varied environments. At some point, a population of these hominins reached Flores, likely through a series of crossings that remain only partially understood. Once isolated, they encountered conditions that differed from those of the regions they left behind. Within this confined setting, the same pressures observed in other species appear to have taken hold. Limited resources, reduced competition, and the absence of certain predators created an environment where smaller body size could be advantageous. Over tens of thousands of years, the population shifted, producing individuals whose proportions reflected these conditions. The reduction from 1.8 meters to approximately 1.1 meters follows a pattern similar to that seen in other large animals under island constraints. Despite this change in size, Homo floresiensis maintained behaviors that indicate a capacity for tool use and coordinated activity. Fossil remains of dwarf stegodons, small island elephants, have been found in association with the same deposits, suggesting that these hominins engaged with prey that required planning and effort to obtain. The relationship between body size and behavior in this case does not align with simple assumptions, instead revealing a more complex interaction between physical form and capability. Not all interpretations of these findings have been uniform. Some researchers have proposed that the remains represent individuals with pathological conditions rather than a distinct species. However, the majority of current analysis supports the view that Homo floresiensis represents a separate lineage shaped by long-term isolation. The consistency of skeletal features across multiple individuals strengthens this perspective, pointing toward a population-level adaptation rather than isolated anomalies. The presence of such a species introduces a broader implication. The same processes that reshaped elephants and other animals on islands appear to have extended into the genus Homo. Body size, often considered a defining trait within human evolution, proves responsive to environmental conditions in ways that mirror patterns seen across other forms of life. On Flores, a lineage of hominins followed a path distinct from those unfolding elsewhere. While populations on other continents developed in different directions, influenced by their own environments, this group adapted to the constraints of an island, producing a form that reflects those specific pressures. Within the quiet layers of Liangbua, this history remains preserved, offering a view into a variation of human evolution shaped not by expansion, but by confinement, where the same underlying forces guided a familiar lineage toward an unfamiliar form. Beneath the visible shifts in body size and behavior, another process unfolds at a quieter scale, carried within strands of DNA that pass from one generation to the next. The changes that shape island life often appear sudden when viewed through the lens of deep time, yet their pace follows patterns that begin long before any shoreline is reached. On the mainland, populations exist under a steady form of refinement, sometimes described as purifying selection. Individuals whose traits drift too far from what the environment favors are gradually removed from the gene pool. Over many generations, this maintains a narrow range of variation, holding body size and physiology within limits that have proven reliable. Stability emerges not from stillness, but from constant filtering. When a small group becomes isolated, that filtering shifts. The pressures that once removed certain variations may weaken or disappear, allowing traits that were previously rare to persist. This condition, often referred to as relaxed purifying selection, opens space within the population for new combinations of traits to take hold. What was once constrained begins to move more freely. The initial group that arrives carries only a fragment of the genetic diversity present in its source population. This reduction, known as the founder effect, means that the future of the population is built from a limited set of genetic possibilities. Within that small sample, alleles associated with particular body sizes or growth patterns may be overrepresented simply by chance. As generations pass, these traits can become common, not through deliberate direction, but through the mathematics of inheritance within a small group. Alongside this, most species already contain a reservoir of variation in their genomes. Differences in growth rate, metabolism, and final body size exist even within stable populations, often held in check by the demands of their environment. This standing genetic variation provides the raw material for change. When conditions shift, selection does not need to wait for entirely new mutations to appear. It can act immediately on variations that were present all along. This interplay helps explain the pace observed on islands. Evolution proceeds by amplifying what already exists, rather than constructing entirely new traits from the beginning. The genome functions less as a fixed script and more as a collection of possibilities, with different elements becoming prominent under different conditions. As certain variants confer even slight advantages, their frequency increases and the population begins to shift in measurable ways. Genomic studies have begun to trace these patterns in detail. Research on island fox populations, for example, has identified changes in pathways associated with growth regulation, including genes linked to growth hormone receptors. These pathways are not unique to a single species. They are part of a broader biological framework that influences body size across mammals. On the islands, subtle shifts in how these genes are expressed or regulated can lead to pronounced differences in physical form over relatively short spans of time. Such findings suggest that the transformation seen in island species is not the result of entirely new genetic instructions, but of adjustments in how existing instructions are used. The underlying sequences remain largely familiar, yet the outcomes differ because the context has changed. Environmental conditions act as a guide, influencing which traits are favored and which are allowed to fade. In this way, the rapid evolution observed on islands reflects a release of potential that was always present. The constraints that once held variation in balance loosen, and the population explores a wider range of possibilities. Within that exploration, certain forms prove more suited to the new conditions, and over generations, those forms become the defining features of life in isolation. The genetic landscape remains continuous, yet its expression shifts, revealing how quickly change can unfold when long-standing boundaries are quietly lifted. Across oceans that never touch, patterns begin to echo. Islands separated by thousands of kilometers, formed in different eras and climates, produce life that seems to follow familiar contours. The species are unrelated, their histories independent, yet their outcomes align with quiet precision, as though each isolated world is solving the same problem in its own language. This repetition is known as convergent evolution, a process in which distinct lineages arrive at similar traits because they are shaped by similar pressures. It does not rely on shared ancestry. Instead, it reflects the constraints and opportunities imposed by an environment, guiding different organisms toward comparable solutions. On islands, where conditions simplify and intensify at the same time, this convergence becomes especially clear. Consider the recurring rise of large tortoises. In the Galapagos, one lineage expanded into forms that could carry substantial weight, extend their reach to higher vegetation, and endure long periods without water. Far across the Indian Ocean, Aldabra produced a separate lineage that followed a nearly identical path. These tortoises share no recent common origin that would explain their size, yet the conditions of their islands shape them toward the same form, as if the environment itself were sketching the outline. A similar rhythm appears in birds. Flight, once essential, has been set aside again and again on islands where ground predators were absent. This transition has occurred independently in many regions, each time reducing the energetic burden of maintaining large flight muscles and specialized skeletal structures. The resulting birds differ in detail, yet they share a common direction: bodies adapted for life on the ground, movement guided more by terrain than by air. Among mammals, rodents offer another example. On islands scattered across the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Atlantic, small ancestral forms expanded into larger bodies, filling roles that mainland ecosystems reserve for entirely different animals. These rodents did not inherit their size from a shared ancestor. Instead, they responded to similar ecological openings, growing into niches that rewarded greater reach, strength, and endurance. The pattern repeats in the opposite direction as well. Large herbivores, arriving on islands from different continents, have independently reduced their size across regions that never intersect. Cyprus, Malta, Sicily, Sardinia, and more distant shores each hosted their own histories of dwarfing. The details vary, yet the trajectory remains consistent, shaped by limited resources and altered balances within each isolated system. Behavior follows the same logic. Fearlessness appears in species that have never encountered certain kinds of predators. Birds, reptiles, and mammals across distant archipelagos exhibit a similar calm in the presence of threats that would provoke immediate flight elsewhere. This is not shared learning, but parallel absence, the removal of a pressure that once shaped instinct. These repetitions are not coincidences gathered by chance. They reveal a deeper regularity, a framework within which evolution operates. When the same conditions arise, the same responses become likely, even across lineages that have never met. The pathways are not identical in every detail, yet they converge on outcomes that reflect the structure of the environment. This leads toward a broader idea, sometimes described as evolutionary inevitability. Given a particular set of pressures, the range of viable solutions narrows, guiding life toward forms that satisfy those constraints. Variation remains, and chance still plays its role, yet the direction of change becomes more predictable than it might first appear. In this sense, islands act as repeated experiments, each one testing how life responds when familiar pressures are removed or rearranged. The answers, emerging again and again, suggest that evolution is not an open field of endless possibilities, but a process guided by underlying principles that shape its outcomes. What appears as a collection of unusual cases resolves into a pattern with structure and consistency. The transformations seen across isolated lands are expressions of the same quiet logic, unfolding wherever the conditions allow. A young naturalist stepping onto unfamiliar ground does not yet know which details will matter. In the closing months of 1835, Charles Darwin moved across the scattered islands of the Galapagos Islands, gathering specimens with careful attention, but without a clear sense of the larger pattern forming around him. The journey aboard the HMS Beagle had already traced coastlines and continents, yet here the terrain felt different, as though each island held its own quiet variation of the same underlying design. Over roughly 5 weeks, he visited several islands, collecting birds, reptiles, and plants, noting differences that seemed subtle at first glance. Finches with slightly altered beaks, mockingbirds with variations in plumage, tortoises whose shell shapes differed from island to island. These observations remained fragments until later, when he returned to London and worked with John Gould. It was then that the pieces aligned, revealing that what appeared to be minor variation was in fact evidence of divergence, each island shaping its inhabitants along its own path. The finches became one of the clearest expressions of this process. 18 species, all descending from a single ancestral bird that arrived millions of years earlier, had spread across the archipelago. Each population encountered different foods, seeds of varying hardness, insects hidden in bark, nectar within flowers. Over time, their beaks shifted in form, some broad and powerful, others slender and precise, each shape suited to a specific way of feeding. This transformation did not require the invention of entirely new structures, only the gradual adjustment of proportions already present within the lineage. Elsewhere on the islands, the same principle unfolded in different directions. The marine iguana, known as Amblyrhynchus cristatus, carried its body into the ocean, feeding on algae beneath the surface. Its ancestors had been land dwellers, yet isolation and opportunity guided it toward a new way of life. Limbs, lungs, and behavior adapted together, forming a creature that moves between shore and sea with quiet efficiency. On another set of islands, a bird once capable of flight became grounded. The flightless cormorant, Phylacrocorax harrisi, developed reduced wings, no longer sufficient for sustained flight. In an environment where terrestrial predators were absent, the energy required to maintain large wings and powerful flight muscles no longer provided a clear advantage. Over generations, those structures diminished, and the bird shifted its focus toward diving and swimming, its body reshaped for a different kind of movement. Even among the larger inhabitants, variation continued to reflect the influence of isolation. The giant tortoises of the islands, part of the Chelonoidus niger group, displayed shell forms that corresponded to the landscapes they occupied. Some carried domed shells suited to abundant ground vegetation, while others developed raised fronts that allowed their necks to extend upward toward higher food sources. Each form represented a response to local conditions, shaped gradually across generations. These examples did not immediately resolve into a single theory. For Darwin, they accumulated slowly, requiring time and reflection before their significance became clear. What the islands revealed was not a sudden transformation, but a steady process in which populations, once separated, follow their own trajectories. The differences observed were not random variations, but coherent adjustments guided by the demands of each environment. In this way, the Galapagos served as a quiet demonstration of a broader principle. Isolation creates space for divergence, allowing forms to shift in ways that would be constrained elsewhere. The patterns later described as part of the island rule were already present in these observations, woven into the details of beak, limb, and shell. What emerged from these islands was not a single discovery, but a framework for understanding change itself, a recognition that life, when separated and shaped by new conditions, does not remain fixed, but continues to adapt, quietly and continuously, across the expanse of time. A map of the world, when viewed with attention to life rather than land, reveals that certain small places carry a disproportionate weight. Scattered across the oceans, islands hold an intensity of biological variation that far exceeds their size, each one acting as a quiet center of creation where lineages branch and linger in forms found nowhere else. This pattern is described through endemism, the condition in which a species exists in a single place and nowhere beyond it. On islands, this becomes the rule rather than the exception. Isolation limits movement, separating populations and allowing them to follow their own paths over long spans of time. With each separation, divergence accumulates, and new forms emerge that remain tied to their place of origin. The Hawaiian archipelago offers a clear illustration. Though it accounts for a small fraction of the land area within the United States, it contains a remarkable share of its most vulnerable species. Among its forests and volcanic slopes, a single ancestral finch gave rise to dozens of honeycreeper species, each shaped by different diets and habitats. Alongside them, hundreds of fruit fly species evolved, each adapted to specific ecological niches, their diversity unfolding within a confined space. Far to the west, Madagascar presents another form of this concentration. Separated from Africa for tens of millions of years, it became a world apart, where evolution continued along lines no longer connected to the mainland. A large proportion of its species exist only there, forming ecosystems that reflect a long history of isolation. Among these are the lemurs, representing some of the most ancient branches of primate evolution still alive today. Their persistence is tied to the absence of competing groups that elsewhere replaced or displaced similar forms. Across the Atlantic and into other oceans, the pattern repeats with quiet consistency. The Canary Islands, the Caribbean, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka each hold assemblages of life that exist only within their boundaries. Plants, birds, reptiles, and insects have followed separate trajectories, producing combinations of traits that reflect the particular conditions of each island group. The details differ, yet the underlying process remains the same: isolation giving rise to diversity. This concentration of unique life is not an incidental feature. It is a direct consequence of the same mechanisms that shape body, size, and behavior. When populations are confined and pressures shift, evolution moves along new paths, generating forms that would not arise in more connected environments. Over time, these forms accumulate, and islands become repositories of distinct biological histories. Yet the same conditions that foster such richness also carry a quiet fragility. Species that evolve in isolation often lack the defenses and adaptations required to respond to sudden change. Their ranges are limited, their populations smaller, and their interactions finely tuned to stable conditions. When those conditions shift abruptly, the balance is easily disrupted. Since the beginning of recorded history, a large proportion of documented animal extinctions have occurred on islands. The arrival of new predators, competitors, or diseases can alter the system faster than adaptation can respond. In many cases, the traits that once ensured success become liabilities when the environment changes in ways the species has never encountered. This contrast between creation and loss forms a subtle arithmetic. Isolation allows life to diversify in remarkable ways, producing forms that exist nowhere else. At the same time, it concentrates risk, placing entire lineages within limited spaces where a single disturbance can have far-reaching effects. In this balance, islands reveal both the generative and vulnerable aspects of evolution. They stand as places where life explores its possibilities with clarity and where the outcomes of those explorations remain closely tied to the conditions that shape them. There is a quiet imbalance woven into isolated worlds, one that only becomes visible when conditions shift. The same processes that shape distinct forms of life also narrow the range within which those forms can endure. Over long spans of time, this remains hidden, as each species exists in alignment with its surroundings. When change arrives abruptly, the limits of that alignment begin to show. Island populations are, by their nature, small. A few individuals give rise to entire lineages, and even as generations pass, their numbers remain constrained by the boundaries of land and resource. Within such populations, genetic diversity is reduced, not by failure, but by origin. With fewer variations available, the capacity to respond to sudden challenges becomes limited. A disease that might pass lightly through a large mainland population can move differently through a smaller one, where resistance is less varied and recovery more fragile. Behavior follows a similar path. In environments where certain threats have never existed, there is no selection for responses to those threats. Over generations, instincts related to avoidance or defense fade, not through loss in a dramatic sense, but through simple absence of use. When new predators arrive, introduced through human movement across oceans, they encounter species that do not recognize them as danger. Rats move through nests undisturbed, cats hunt without resistance, and the balance shifts rapidly. The relationship between species and place becomes another point of sensitivity. Many island organisms evolve in close association with specific plants, soils, or microclimates. Their lives are tied to particular conditions that remain stable for long periods. When those conditions are altered, whether through land clearing, introduced grazing animals, or shifts in vegetation, the effects are immediate. The narrow range that once provided efficiency becomes a constraint, leaving little room for adjustment. Across the Pacific, these dynamics unfolded repeatedly as human settlement spread over thousands of years. Beginning roughly 3,500 years ago, island ecosystems encountered new forms of disturbance. Hunting, habitat change, and introduced species combined to produce a wave of extinctions. It is estimated that between 1,000 and 2,000 bird species disappeared during this period, a loss representing a substantial portion of avian diversity that existed at the time. The pattern extends into more recent centuries. The Rhaphis cucullatus vanished from Mauritius within decades of contact. In New Zealand, the great moa and the Hieratus moray disappeared within a similarly brief span following human arrival. On Madagascar, the towering Apiornis met the same fate. In the Caribbean, the Monachus tropicalis declined under pressure, while in northern waters, the Hydrodamalus gigas was lost within a few decades of discovery. These events are not isolated incidents. Since the beginning of the modern era, islands have experienced extinction rates far exceeding those of mainland regions when measured against their area. The difference reflects not chance, but structure, a direct outcome of the conditions under which island species evolve. What emerges is a consistent relationship between adaptation and vulnerability. Traits that are finely tuned to a stable environment allow species to thrive with remarkable efficiency. That same precision reduces flexibility when the environment changes beyond the range those traits were shaped to meet. In this way, isolation carries both creation and constraint within it. It allows life to specialize in ways that produce extraordinary forms while also limiting the breadth of response available when those forms encounter unfamiliar pressures. The result is a delicate balance, one that can persist for long periods, yet can be altered quickly when the conditions that sustained it are no longer present. In some places, the pattern does not end with loss. There are moments when the process shifts direction, not by reversing time, but by adjusting the conditions that shape what follows. On islands, where change can move quickly, small interventions can alter the balance in equally visible ways. Restoration begins with removal. Species introduced from elsewhere, often without intention, become dominant forces in environments that did not evolve to withstand them. Rats, cats, and other mammals reshape entire ecosystems through predation and competition. Conservation efforts on many islands now focus on carefully eliminating these introduced populations, allowing native species to persist within the conditions that once supported them. Off the coast of New Zealand, several islands have been transformed into sanctuaries through this approach. By removing all non-native mammals, conservationists have recreated spaces where species that cannot survive on the mainland can exist again without constant pressure. Birds that nest on the ground, reptiles that evolved without mammalian predators, and insects that occupy narrow ecological roles begin to re-establish their populations. These islands function as contained environments where the absence of certain pressures restores a form of stability. Among the species that have responded to such efforts is the Strigops habroptilus, a nocturnal parrot whose population once declined to only 51 individuals in the mid-1990s. Each remaining bird was moved to protected islands, where monitoring, supplemental feeding, and careful management supported their survival. Over time, their numbers increased, reaching more than 250 individuals by 2023. The process required sustained attention, yet it demonstrated that recovery is possible when the conditions shaping decline are addressed directly. A similar pattern unfolded along the coast of California with the Urocyon littoralis. At one point, some island populations fell to fewer than 15 individuals, threatened by predation from introduced golden eagles. Conservation efforts removed those predators and reintroduced Haliaeetus leucocephalus, which occupy the same territory but do not prey on foxes. With the balance adjusted, fox populations began to recover rapidly, and several subspecies were removed from endangered status within little more than a decade. On the Galapagos Islands, long-term work with giant tortoises has followed a different path, combining captive breeding with reintroduction. One lineage, reduced to only 15 individuals during the 1960s, became the focus of a coordinated effort to rebuild its population. Over generations, individuals raised in controlled conditions were returned to their native island, where they began to reproduce in the wild. The population has since grown into the thousands, restoring a presence that once seemed near its end. These examples reveal a consistent principle. When the factors that disrupt island ecosystems are identified, they can often be addressed with precision. The same understanding that explains vulnerability also indicates where intervention is most effective. Removing invasive species, protecting critical habitats, and supporting reproduction are not arbitrary actions. They align directly with the mechanisms that shaped these species in the first place. In this sense, conservation on islands becomes an extension of evolutionary understanding. It does not attempt to create new conditions, but to reestablish the balance under which these forms of life developed. The results vary, and not every effort succeeds, yet the pattern remains clear. Where isolation once allowed distinct life to emerge, careful intervention can help sustain it. The process is quiet and gradual, carried forward across years and decades. It reflects a recognition that the forces shaping life can be influenced not by overriding them, but by adjusting the pressures that guide them. Far from any shoreline, the same quiet logic begins to appear. It does not require waves or salt air, only separation. When a population becomes enclosed, cut off from wider exchange, the familiar pressures loosen and new ones take hold, shaping life along paths that echo those found on distant islands. High above surrounding valleys, certain mountain peaks rise as isolated habitats. These elevated environments, often called sky islands, are separated from one another by lowlands that act as barriers rather than corridors. Species that live on one summit rarely cross to another. Over time, populations confined to these heights begin to diverge. Body sizes shift, behaviors narrow, and forms adapt to the limited resources and cooler climates of their surroundings. The pattern resembles what has already been seen elsewhere, though here it unfolds among ridgelines and thin air rather than ocean boundaries. A similar quiet transformation occurs underground. In cave systems, isolation takes on a different texture, one defined by darkness and constancy. Organisms that enter these environments and remain there for generations gradually lose features that no longer serve them. Eyes diminish, pigmentation fades, and sensory structures lengthen, extending into the stillness where vision holds no advantage. Energy is redirected toward functions that matter within this confined space. The result is not random alteration, but a steady refinement shaped by the absence of light and the scarcity of food. Water, too, can create boundaries as complete as any coastline. Lakes that form in enclosed basins become isolated worlds, their inhabitants separated from surrounding rivers and seas. Within these contained systems, fish populations diversify with unusual speed. In the lakes of Africa's Rift Valley, cichlid species have radiated into hundreds of distinct forms within spans of time that are brief on a geological scale. Variations in jaw structure, coloration, and body size emerge as populations adapt to specific feeding niches and microhabitats within the same body of water. The process mirrors the branching patterns seen in more familiar island settings, though it unfolds beneath the surface. Even within landscapes shaped by human activity, fragments of habitat begin to behave in similar ways. Forest patches divided by roads and cities form pockets where populations become partially isolated. Movement between these patches is limited, gene flow reduced, and local conditions begin to exert stronger influence. Early studies suggest subtle shifts in size, behavior, and genetic structure within these fragmented populations. The changes are not yet as pronounced as those observed in long isolated systems, yet the direction is recognizable, guided by the same underlying pressures. Across all these settings, a shared condition emerges. Boundaries restrict movement, resources become finite, and interactions simplify. Under these circumstances, traits that were once maintained by broader ecological networks are reconsidered by selection. Some diminish, others expand, and new balances form. The pattern does not depend on geography alone. It arises wherever separation alters the equation that life must solve. Seen in this way, the island is less a location than a state of being. It is any place where exchange is limited and conditions differ from the surrounding world. The responses that follow are not isolated curiosities, but expressions of a broader principle. Evolution, when confined, does not wander without direction. It adjusts with quiet consistency, guided by the contours of the environment that holds it. The same process that reshapes creatures along remote coasts continues wherever isolation takes root, unfolding steadily, often unnoticed, within the boundaries that define each contained world. Seen across the breadth of deep time, no island remains still. Land emerges, lingers for a while, then sinks or erodes away, leaving only faint traces beneath the surface. What appears stable within a human lifetime is, on a geological scale, a brief arrangement in a long sequence of transformations. Volcanic islands offer one of the clearest expressions of this cycle. Along chains, such as those stretching across the central Pacific, new land rises from the ocean floor where magma reaches the surface. Over time, that land drifts with the slow motion of tectonic plates, moving away from the source that formed it. Rain, wind, and waves begin their gradual work, wearing the island down. The highest peaks soften, slopes collapse, and coral reefs may form as the land subsides. Eventually, what was once a green island becomes a low ring of reef, and then disappears beneath the water entirely, leaving only a submerged seamount as evidence of its existence. Elsewhere, entire basins have shifted between land and sea. Several million years ago, the region now known as the Mediterranean experienced a profound transformation. Tectonic changes restricted its connection to the Atlantic, and evaporation exceeded inflow, leaving vast stretches of exposed seabed. For a period measured in geological terms, the basin became a landscape of salt flats and isolated water pockets. Then, through a narrow opening at what is now the Strait of Gibraltar, ocean water surged back in. The refilling unfolded on a scale difficult to imagine, reshaping the entire region within a comparatively brief span. Landscapes that had supported terrestrial life were submerged, and new coastlines were drawn in their place. Fluctuations in global climate have repeatedly altered sea levels, exposing land bridges during colder periods and submerging them when temperatures rose. Each shift rearranged the map of connection and separation. Regions, once joined, became isolated, and isolated areas were briefly linked again. With every change, populations found themselves either reunited or divided, and evolutionary pathways adjusted accordingly. The boundaries that define an island are therefore not fixed lines, but moving edges that advance and retreat over time. Even beneath the ocean's surface, isolation persists. Seamounts, formed by extinct volcanoes, rise from the deep seabed and host communities adapted to their specific conditions. These underwater elevations function as discrete habitats, separated by vast stretches of deeper water. Species that inhabit one seamount may differ markedly from those on another, shaped by the same principles of confinement and limited exchange, though hidden from view. At a larger scale, the drifting of continents has produced some of the most enduring forms of isolation. When ancient supercontinents fragmented, Each resulting landmass carried with it a portion of the living world set adrift for millions of years. Over time, these separated regions developed distinct assemblages of life, each reflecting the conditions and constraints of its own trajectory through space and climate. The long histories of such land masses reveal patterns that echo those seen on smaller islands, extended across far greater spans of time. Through all these changes, a consistent theme emerges. Wherever boundaries form and persist, whether for thousands or millions of years, life adjusts in response. The processes observed in present landscapes are part of a continuum that stretches back to the earliest complex organisms. Islands, in this broader sense, are temporary stages within an ongoing planetary rhythm where isolation appears, shapes life, and eventually dissolves, only to form again elsewhere. There is a quiet clarity that begins to emerge when these patterns are viewed together, as though the shifting forms across isolated worlds are not separate stories, but variations on a single theme. The changes in size, behavior, and form begin to feel less like anomalies and more like direct answers, shaped by conditions that ask very specific things of living bodies. Across these examples, one idea settles into place. Evolution does not move toward a goal. It does not prefer large over small, or complex over simple. What appears in any given lineage is the result of what works under the conditions present at that moment. A massive mainland herbivore and its much smaller island counterpart stand as equally complete expressions of adaptation. Each is fitted with precision to the environment that surrounds it, neither representing a higher or lower state, only a different solution. This reveals something deeper about biological form. No body is inevitable. The shape, size, and behavior of any organism arise from a particular history of pressures, filtered through generations of selection. If those pressures change, even slightly, the path shifts. What seems stable is only the current balance between organism and environment, maintained for as long as conditions remain consistent. On large, connected landscapes, many species exist within a narrow range of possibilities. Competition is constant, predation persistent, and resources contested. Under these circumstances, populations tend to cluster around forms that have already proven effective. Deviations are often costly, removed by selection before they can spread. This creates the impression of permanence, as though each species has settled into a fixed design. Isolation alters that balance. When populations become separated, many of the constraints that once held them in place begin to loosen. The absence of certain pressures, or the introduction of new ones, allows traits that were previously rare or suppressed to persist. This release does not introduce entirely new possibilities from nothing. Instead, it draws from variation that already exists within the population, revealing capacities that were always present but rarely expressed. The speed at which these changes can occur becomes striking when viewed over short spans of time. Transformations that appear dramatic in form may unfold within a relatively small number of generations. This is not because evolution suddenly accelerates in a literal sense, but because the conditions that limit variation have shifted. When selection begins to favor different traits, the response can be swift, guided by genetic diversity that has been carried quietly through countless generations. In this way, isolated environments function as natural experiments. They reveal what happens when familiar constraints are removed, when competition thins, or when entirely new opportunities emerge. The outcomes, though varied in detail, follow recognizable patterns. Bodies adjust, proportions shift, and behaviors realign, each change tracing back to the pressures that shape it. What becomes visible through this lens is a form of flexibility that is easy to overlook in more stable settings. Life is not rigidly bound to its current expression. It holds within it a range of possibilities, constrained not by lack of variation, but by the conditions that determine which variations can persist. When those conditions change, even slightly, the range of expression widens. The patterns traced across isolated systems do not stand apart from the broader process of evolution. They are a clearer view of it, simplified by circumstance. Within these boundaries, the underlying nature of adaptation becomes easier to see, not as a march toward complexity or size, but as a continuous, responsive adjustment to the world as it is. Sometimes the story narrows to a handful of lives, carried across a boundary they did not choose, arriving in a place that offers no familiar guidance. There is no inherited memory of this terrain, no long lineage shaped by its patterns. Only a small beginning, set down in quiet isolation, where every day unfolds under conditions that differ from everything that came before. In those early generations, survival depends on what is already present within the body, yet the environment begins to press in new directions. Food may be arranged differently, space may feel more confined, and the rhythms of danger or safety may shift in ways that leave no clear precedent. What follows is not sudden transformation, but a gradual alignment. Traits that once held little significance begin to matter. Others fade in importance. Across time, the population adjusts, not through intention, but through the steady filtering of what endures. Within this process, there is a kind of quiet persistence. A lineage continues, generation after generation, carrying forward fragments of its past while reshaping itself to meet present conditions. The result is not a return to what was, nor a departure without connection, but a form that reflects both inheritance and change. The body becomes a record, each feature shaped by pressures that were once unfamiliar, now fully integrated. In certain places, these outcomes take on forms that feel deeply specific. A bird moves through dense forest, guided more by scent than by sight, its anatomy attuned to a world where other senses have taken precedence. A slow-moving herbivore carries a shell that reflects the contours of a landscape that has shifted over time, yet still leaves its imprint on form. A small predator navigates a limited range, its size and movement matching the scale of the environment it inhabits. Each example stands as a continuation of a long adjustment, shaped by conditions that never required awareness, only persistence. What becomes visible across these lives is not struggle in the dramatic sense, but a sustained process of fitting. Isolation does not halt the movement of life, it redirects it. The absence of familiar pressures creates space for different expressions to emerge, and over many generations, those expressions settle into coherence with their surroundings. The lineage becomes something that could not have existed elsewhere, not because it was destined to, but because the conditions allowed it. There is a certain stillness in this realization. Change unfolds without urgency, guided by the quiet logic of selection. Each generation carries forward what has proven viable, refining it in small increments. Over time, the accumulation of these changes produces forms that appear distinct, yet remain rooted in the same fundamental process. Within this continuity, there is a form of resilience that does not rely on awareness or intention. Life persists by adjusting, by holding on to variation and allowing it to be shaped by circumstance. Boundaries do not end that process. They define it, creating spaces where different outcomes can take form. Across all such places, whether separated by water, elevation, or other barriers, the same pattern can be traced. A population becomes enclosed, conditions shift, and over time, a new balance emerges. The result is neither loss nor gain in any simple sense, but a transformation that reflects the environment that holds it. Across the long arc of this story, the focus has remained on bodies shaped by separation, on forms that shift when boundaries hold them in place. Yet there is another layer, quieter and closer, where the same logic can be sensed without belonging to biology in the strict sense. Human beings move differently through the world. Our connections extend across continents, carried by language, tools, and shared knowledge. Ideas travel faster than generations, and cultures exchange influences in ways that soften the edges of isolation. In this sense, the processes that reshape animal bodies over thousands of generations do not operate on us in the same direct way. Our species remains linked even across vast distances. And still, separation has left its mark in other forms. Where groups of people have lived apart, whether on remote islands, within high mountain ranges, or across expanses of desert and ice, distinct ways of life have emerged. Languages take on structures found nowhere else. Tools reflect the materials and challenges of a particular place. Knowledge systems develop in response to local conditions, refined through experience rather than comparison. These variations are not random. They arise from the same principle that has guided the changes seen elsewhere, that bounded environments shape what can be created within them. In oceanic regions scattered across the Pacific, communities developed methods of navigation that relied on reading currents, stars, and the subtle movements of waves. These practices formed in settings where land was sparse and distances vast, requiring an intimate understanding of the sea. In other regions, agricultural systems adapted to limited soils and shifting climates, producing techniques that sustained populations in ways suited to their surroundings. Artistic traditions, too, carry the imprint of place, reflecting both the materials available and the meanings shaped within a particular environment. These outcomes do not mirror the biological patterns exactly, yet they echo the underlying structure. When exchange is limited, what exists within a community deepens and diversifies along its own path. External influences arrive less frequently, and internal variations have more space to develop. Over time, this leads to forms of expression that feel singular, rooted in a specific context that cannot be replicated elsewhere. Isolation, in this sense, is not only a narrowing, it is also a focusing. Within boundaries, certain possibilities become more prominent, shaped by necessity and sustained attention. The resulting cultures carry a clarity that reflects the conditions in which they formed, just as living forms reflect the pressures that shaped them. This observation does not turn the biological process into a metaphor, nor does it suggest equivalence between different domains. It simply notes that the logic underlying these patterns can be recognized across different layers of experience. Bounded conditions alter outcomes. What develops within those conditions carries the imprint of that boundary. There is a quiet continuity here. The same world that shapes the forms of animals also shapes the ways in which human communities live and create, though through different mechanisms. In both cases, separation defines a space within which change unfolds, guided by what is present and what is absent. Within that space, something distinct takes form, not because it was intended, but because it was possible there and nowhere else in quite the same way. On a quiet shoreline long ago, a small elephant moved through a landscape that matched it perfectly. Its body carried the memory of generations shaped by limited ground and measured seasons. Every step, every proportion, every need aligned with the place it inhabited. Nothing was excessive, nothing missing. The world it lived in was not incomplete, it was exact. That balance held for thousands of years. The conditions remained stable enough for life to refine itself into forms that answered them with precision. Each generation inherited not only genes, but a fit, a correspondence between body and environment that had been slowly tuned over time. The result was a system that worked without excess or strain, held together by the quiet continuity of selection. Then, within a span too brief to register on that long scale, the conditions shifted. New arrivals brought unfamiliar pressures, not through intention, but through presence. Animals that had never encountered certain forms of predation or competition found themselves exposed to them. Landscapes were altered, sometimes subtly, sometimes abruptly. The questions that the environment asked began to change, but the answers carried in those bodies could not adjust quickly enough. What followed was not a failure of adaptation. It was a mismatch between the pace of change and the pace at which evolution operates. The forms that had once been perfectly suited to their surroundings were now confronted with conditions they had no history of meeting. Precision, which had been an advantage, became a vulnerability when the context shifted beyond recognition. This pattern has repeated across many isolated systems. It is not a story of weakness, but of specialization encountering disruption. The same processes that produced remarkable diversity also produced forms that depended on continuity. When that continuity broke, the consequences unfolded with a consistency that is now well understood. That understanding carries weight. Knowledge of how isolation shapes life also reveals how sensitive those systems are to sudden change. The introduction of new species, the alteration of habitats, the shifting of ecological balances, all of these have predictable effects in environments where adaptation has been finely tuned over long periods. What was once uncertain is now clearer, and with that clarity comes the ability to act differently. In certain places, careful intervention has begun to restore fragments of what was lost. Predators introduced by human activity have been removed from specific areas, allowing native species to recover. Populations once reduced to a handful of individuals have grown, supported by conditions that more closely resemble those under which they evolved. These efforts do not reverse time, yet they demonstrate that outcomes can change when actions align with understanding. The presence of these recoveries offers a quiet counterpoint to the broader pattern. They show that the same principles that explain vulnerability can also guide protection. By recognizing the factors that shaped these forms, it becomes possible to create conditions in which they can persist. Beyond these efforts, isolated environments continue to exist across the planet, each one shaping life in ways that remain only partially observed. Within them, populations continue to adjust, responding to their specific circumstances with the same steady processes that have always guided evolution. New variations emerge, not as anomalies, but as expressions of those conditions. What remains is a simple recognition. These systems are not separate from the broader story of life, yet they reveal it with unusual clarity. Within their boundaries, the relationship between organism and environment becomes visible in a direct way, showing how closely form is tied to context. To notice this is to understand something fundamental. The living world does not stand apart from its conditions. It is shaped by them, continuously and precisely. Where those conditions are allowed to remain, life continues to adapt within them. Where they are altered abruptly, the balance shifts. In that awareness, there is a quiet responsibility, not an abstract idea, but a practical one, grounded in what has already been observed. The same knowledge that reveals how these forms came to be also shows what they require to remain.